Have you ever gotten halfway through a funny story before realizing that the people you were speaking to didn't have any of the history needed to understand just how funny it was? The punchline kind of falls flat in those moments, doesn't it? There's a lot to be said for shared stories and shared language. They connect us in powerful ways. The Apostle Paul often found himself speaking to Jewish people, his people, about Jesus. In these moments, he could draw on their shared history to really emphasize his point. But in Acts 17, we find Paul in a strange situation, a strange place, faced with the challenge of speaking to Greeks in Athens about the reality of Jesus Christ. This was a unique moment for Paul because as he was invited to share at the Areopagus, to share his message about Jesus, he realized that he couldn't lean on the shared stories that he had. He couldn't talk about the nation of Israel or the patriarchs or Adam and Eve. These stories were foreign to the Athenians. Instead, he needed to find other ways of connecting with them. As he walked around and noticed their city full of idols, he praised them for their spirituality and began one of his most famous sermons ever. In this sermon, he replaced all of the common Jewish language and common stories which spoke of Israel and the people of God, and instead he opened up that story to the people that were in front of him. He spoke of God as the God who created the whole world and everything in it, the God who gives all things life and breath and everything else. The message Paul shared was one that clearly showed his listeners, his audience, that they were already part of the story of God. They were not excluded by the God of history. Paul connected with his listeners by drawing from contemporary culture, the idols they had around their city. He even quoted poetry written in honor of the pagan god of all creation, Zeus. What's the point? Well, in order for Paul to be able to communicate the love of God to the people of Athens, he needed to find ways to connect to them. And in order to do that, he needed to connect to their culture and their world. He needed to connect to their stories. I wonder if you have a phobia or a fear of some kind. When I was younger, it was spiders. Some people are scared of the dark or of closed spaces or open spaces or social interactions or religion or a myriad of other things that there are to be terrified of. What we should really be scared of, however, is that we live on a planet that's just dangling in the middle of space, suspended by nothing other than the gravitational forces we know very little about. One movement closer to the sun and we're fried. One movement away and we're all frozen. And yet somehow the entire universe seems to sit in balance, all of the various forces working in harmony to support life on this planet that we know and we love. The universe itself is a testimony to what I like to call the ecology of connection, a web of interconnected relationality that holds us all together. Cultivating an ecology of connection that sees relationships as a fundamental part of life in every context is a critical aspect of what we call the mission of God. See, from the story of Paul in Athens, I want to suggest 4 aspects of this ecology of connection that might help us in our journey. Firstly, we talk about spiritual connection. Many students in schools these days profess a faith in Jesus and look to staff to help nurture and develop this faith, but others don't. Regardless, one of the things the story in Acts tells us is that whether someone professes a faith or not, there's a divine fingerprint that runs all throughout everything. And sometimes our job is to help young people connect to the fact that they're already part of this story of God. The next part of this ecology of connection is self-connection. As well as being connected to God, we also need to be connected to ourselves, learning to listen to our mind as well as our bodies. Learning how to rest, as well as knowing when to work hard. Learning how to take care of ourselves. Setting boundaries, as well as knowing when to strive and when to sacrifice. All of these things contribute to a deepening sense of self-awareness. There's also a social connectedness. The reality of being a human being is that we need each other. Isolation breeds loneliness, and loneliness kills. In a world where social connection is increasingly under threat from new technological mediums of engagement, our job as educators is to connect students to each other in ways that foster trust and empathy and wholehearted engagement. In Athens, Paul was invited to speak because he spoke in a way that developed trust and respect, and that's important. And finally, we have cultural connection. See, the world we live in is rich with beauty and wonder. From the peace of the forest to the vastness of the ocean to the striking image of a city skyline, there is much to admire in the world. In order for people to be truly connected to God, to each other and to themselves, they must learn to understand and appreciate the way God moves in and through the world, in and through the culture around them. We often focus on the negative aspects of culture that's contrary to faith, particularly when it comes to speaking about our faith, but perhaps we also need to encourage young people to lift their heads up, to see the story that is unfolding all around them. Life is about connection, and connection is how we learn.
We're all born into the world looking for someone looking for us. Kurt Thompson said that, and he's getting at something we teachers know at a gut level. Students thrive when they find themselves in relationships in which they know and are known, love and are loved, where someone is looking for them. Rob Lowe has documented this in his 2018 study on relational schools, which emphasised that Christian education must be a relational enterprise. In the classroom, this enterprise starts with something as simple as introductions at the start of the year, memorising student names as soon as possible, or sharing a quick story from your weekend to kick off a lesson. In one sense, it's really quite simple, but it gets complicated. We need to create safe places for this knowing and being known to happen. Why? Because developing meaningful connections implies vulnerability. As teachers, we need wisdom in learning the appropriate level of vulnerability and self-disclosure to model to our students. And it's vitally important that we carefully shepherd the vulnerability of our students. And of course, we're not just here to develop relationships. We're teachers, and content is king, as the saying goes. When we feel the weight of this obligation, we might say, how can I be expected to foster vital connections throughout my class when I have so much stuff to get through? The relentless, yet still good, demands of curriculum can threaten to squash our passion to make a difference in young lives. So we must be careful to not fall into the trap of thinking that curriculum and connection have discrete agendas. If we get stuck with that mindset, we'll be well on the way to being thoroughly disenchanted with our profession. Connection as a pedagogical approach brings into sharp focus what might otherwise be unhelpfully assumed in our teaching practice. There's a whole lot more going on at school than the curriculum topics. But it reminds us that knowledge and skills acquisition, as well as the overall formation of the students in our care, happens best when they know others and are known by others. And that includes their teachers. Content may be king, but he's married to connection, and the two have become one.